start the downtown Orlando UX meetup. We've rebranded now as Do UX, but for a while we were Ducks, and I still trip up on saying it sometimes. But yes, we're actually celebrating 6 years as a meetup this month. I think just today we just announced our 6-year anniversary meetup that will be coming on later in the month. So feel free to join for that if you're interested. I've been working in enterprise SaaS for a little over a decade now. For the majority of that on the design side, but I did start in development. Currently, I'm making space safer for humans. So I work on some really interesting problems at NASA. But that also, I should mention a disclaimer that I am only speaking as myself tonight. Don't represent any government agency in any way, and all opinions are my own. And then also feel free to say hi on Twitter if you'd like. I'm at Matt P. Lavoie. So what is design? If we're going to talk about assumptions in design, sometimes it helps to kind of frame our story. And so design is one of those weird questions that we ask in school sometimes. Like, okay, let's get philosophical about defining design, but I'm not super interested in that necessarily. I'm just more interested in like that particular exercise of design to solve problems and like achieve outcomes. And so let me kind of just jump to like my definition of design. Very much focuses on when we are kind of designing, we're trying to solve problems for others and we're trying to help those people to reach outcomes, as opposed to kind of anything else that we might do creatively or visually. That's sort of where these assumptions can create problems, right? Is when we're trying to reach outcomes, our assumptions can sometimes lead us astray. So in order to talk through that journey a little bit and maybe illustrate the point, I'm going to share a couple of stories. We were talking a little bit earlier. Feel free to jump in if you have any questions as I'm talking as well. I'm always happy to kind of take a side tangent. I'll kind of talk through a couple of stories and then talk through some strategies for how we can kind of call out and make sure we don't allow assumptions to lead us astray. Oh, I totally forgot about this slide. This one's kind of a fun one. So assumptions can become dangerous when they parade as facts. So this is just one more point before we get into the stories that I wanted to make. So right now, everything you can see on the screen has bunny ears, including this great little dog. And if you grew up in a household like mine, or you didn't have cable, you might have dealt with one of these. So that is also called bunny ears, that antenna. And so if our design problem is feeding all of these things, we obviously shouldn't feed them all with electricity, and we obviously shouldn't feed them all with dog food, because all of these things kind of have different needs as far as their care goes. So this is just a silly little illustration that I like to throw in just to kind of like remind us that assumptions can sometimes seem super obvious, but they're not always obvious to everybody. And a lot of times they can parade as facts, especially if I said, okay, we're dealing with things that all have bunny ears, but you didn't have this visual, you might not connect those dots together, right? And so we can kind of, as a team, design for some problem within a context when we don't really even know necessarily that the whole kind of lens that we're looking through might be a little bit off kilter. Okay, now it is story time, and this one is a personal story. I've got a couple of other stories of just kind of that I've collected over the years, but this was actually, I think, probably the most pivotal moment in my career as a designer. And that is early on when I was working for a company called Powered EMS, where I was at kind of before this. I remember I was working on this one search experience, and the search page, you would run a search and it would basically give you a table of data. And this table was like, we're talking, legacy software. This was a decade ago. So it's like, you can even imagine that Web 2.0 experience and like shiny corners and all of that kind of thing. But this table of data was just so loaded as I was trying to process through, like, what do we really need here? What is the user trying to accomplish on this search page? And right, it's like framed in the context of search. And I was looking at all of this data and was thinking, some of this data might not be necessary. And if we could give the user more focus, we might be able to help them to accomplish their tasks more easily, or at least, identify which of these things they were searching for was the thing that they were searching for. So there was like I think 4 different columns that had date times stamped in them on this particular search. And there's some things about signatures of users that signed off on these particular documents and things like that. And so as I redesigned this one particular view, I removed a column. And I think I changed a way that some of the sorting worked. And I remember like thinking that like being really proud of my work when it got shipped into production. I'm like, wow, that looks great. You know, this looks so clean. And when I search for a document, I'm getting to this like view that is like so much less cluttered. And then I had the wonderful opportunity to go speak with some of our customers at a conference. And these customers are in the policy space. So we're talking about accreditation managers, policy writers, those sorts of folks. And I came across one person who found out that I was a designer working on the software. And she came up to me and was like, so I want to talk to you. I hear that you work on this software and I have a bone to pick. And me being a young user experience designer, anytime you have an angry user, I mean, even now, anytime you have an angry user, that's like a wonderful opportunity, right? I love meeting angry users because there are always opportunities for me to learn about how the software might not be serving them well. So anyways, I was delighted. I was like, yes, let's talk. Let's go through it. We even pulled up the application on a laptop and she was talking through this one particular task that she was required. She worked at a police department, so she was required by her chief to go and run this particular report and take particular action on documents that met a certain criteria. And the way that she was doing that was through search. So she would run this search with these particular filters, and there was a particular column of data that she used to make these decisions that was now no longer available in that view. And I remember just feeling kind of gutted, like, oh no, what did I do? This is awful. I have made this person's life harder. And like, we're talking about enterprise software, right? This is like somebody's getting up for their 9 to 5, going into the office, and they pull up this application. Like it was their job to manage this application, probably like at least half of their 40 hours a week kind of thing. And so this one thing just added hours of work to their day. For this one particular task that I just didn't think through. And it was because I was framing all of my assumptions around the use case of that search experience around my use case, right? I was looking in the mirror thinking like, I know what's needed here because I'm a smart designer and I can do a heuristic evaluation and I can understand the use cases and I've heard the stories. And what I didn't do was, you know, conduct research with users. I didn't talk to anybody about this change. I didn't talk to anybody about how losing this column of data might impact them. And if we had, we may have still decided to make this change, right? This was only one user in the grand scheme of things that I ever found out about that had any issue with this change. But this one user didn't have another option. And perhaps actually what they were trying to do, there was a much better way for us to potentially solve it through a reporting tool or something else that maybe could have made their lives even better. But since I didn't even know about this particular situation or how people might have been using the data that was currently available, I just cut it out without even really thinking about it. So that is story number one and I still think about that as maybe like the most important part of my UX design career as kind of growing as a designer and realizing that it's so important that you don't design for that person in the mirror because that isn't the person that is actually going to have to use this software in their day-to-day. All right, so the next story is actually not quite a story about traditional design, like we're not talking about software here, but I think it's an interesting design problem. And that is, so there was a devastating earthquake in Haiti in 2010. And I was talking to somebody who was actually had worked out there and they told me this story and I was like, wow, this is such an interesting assumptions and design problem. Because essentially this group went out, they moved to Haiti after this earthquake and were supporting a lot of really great communities out there and doing a lot of good work to sort of get people back on track, help rebuild, get, you know, whatever infrastructure or supplies might be needed, all of that kind of thing. And so about 6 months after they had been there, they really formed a very close relationship with this one community in particular. And, you know, a lot of the like sort of immediate needs things had been taken care of. And so they'd gotten together and they were sort of thinking, okay, what is the next thing that we could do to help this community? And they knew there was sometimes a challenge with schools and getting kids to come to school regularly. And, they weren't really necessarily sure why that was happening. But one thought was, the schools are hot. It's a, unair conditioned building in the heat of the day. And it can be really hard to focus. Like they'd found themselves just feeling like fatigued and exhausted being in this space during the day and thinking about these students like, wow, I can't imagine trying to like go to school and focus and all of that day in and day out. So what they did was they actually went out to the, I'm not sure if there was like a store or if they ordered them in, but they thought, there's one way that we could cool this space down, and let's go and buy a bunch of ceiling fans and we'll install ceiling fans in every room of this school. And then that'll make it a lot more comfortable to be in this space during the day, and the students will be more able to focus, and maybe it'll, encourage people to come into school more regularly as well. So they did it. They bought these fans, they went and installed them. And after they did this community, right, that they had formed these really great relationships with, they were like, having meals with these people, they were spending a lot of time with them. All of a sudden, those relationships started to feel kind of awkward and weird and soured a bit. And they weren't really sure why. And so they approached sort of one of the community leaders. They were like, hey, I don't know what we might have done if we did something to offend you or something is wrong here. But it seems like, maybe you're not super happy. What's up, And so what happened was the response was, hey, like, we appreciate you helping us, but we don't need ceiling fans. Like, we don't have air conditioning in these buildings. We don't have ceiling fans in any of our buildings. We're kind of used to it. It's not a big deal. Really, the bigger issue with that school, if you wanted to like, help with that school, is that it leaks, right? Like there's water coming in every time it rains for this particular school building. And so fixing the roof, putting that money towards fixing the roof would be a much more effective use of the money and really more what we need in this moment. And so I know, again, this isn't a piece of software, this isn't an interface where a design challenge is happening, but again, design to me is that, we're trying to implement some change, do something to solve a problem and reach some outcome. So thinking about that full system. And again, this is a situation where there was this assumption of this is an issue, this is a problem, there's an objective that we're after, and how can we get there? And really the objective that they were after wasn't even maybe where they would have gotten to if they'd done some user research first. So I know it's a little bit outside of the realm of what we normally would deal with in kind of the UX field, but I thought it was a really, really interesting and helpful story around assumptions in design. So let's see, I'll go ahead and move on to story number 3. So this is actually a story that was shared. We were actually having a downtown Orlando UX meetup, and we were doing kind of a roundtable talking about challenges people had with design. And one of our members shared this fantastic story. So they were working for a bank, and it was like, one of those kind of smaller banks that has a bunch of different branches, but not like any, super big name or anything. And they were redesigning the bank software. So like entire software suite, right? So all of the software that was being used to manage all of the bank's assets and their tellers, all of that was being switched over. So anytime you would go into this bank and talk with somebody, the software that was on that computer of the person you were talking to. So they had this very huge project. Oh, and something that's also important to note about this software re-architecture overhaul thing that they were doing. The previous software was from that era of like black screen with green text, right? So we're talking, right now these tellers are getting in anytime somebody's making a deposit, doing anything, they're actually using a black screen with green text and having to go through menus and systems like that. And so like this was a brand new visual GUI, it looked great. They were very excited about it, and the team worked on it for, I think it was like 9 months to a year kind of project, or maybe it had been much longer than that, I don't really know. Anyway, so for the rollout, what they ended up doing was they decided they were going to, while the bank was closed over the weekend, upgrade all of the workstations for everybody at the bank. And so essentially, all of these bank tellers kind of went home for the weekend. And when they came back in Monday morning, they had an entirely new software. And I'm not sure, what kind of training they did or what kind of maybe user research or usability testing. But one of the things that they didn't uncover, and I don't know that they did very much usability testing or if they did at all, but one of the things that they did uncover immediately when people were coming in on Monday morning was that as these tellers were, first of all, getting used to new software first thing on a Monday morning, probably when the bank is on its most busy time, but also this new software was visual. It had a GUI, whereas these tellers were used to, black screen, green text, which also meant keyboard only. So what the tellers would do is they would take their hands, they would put it on the keyboard, and they would be talking with, whoever it was, whatever they needed to do, deposit, withdraw, transfer, whatever kind, I don't know what people do at banks. But they would talk with the person and type as they were talking. They wouldn't have to look at the screen necessarily to know what they were doing. And with this new software, while it was beautiful and it actually had way more features and it was much more feature rich, probably did things a lot better. It didn't have any keyboard shortcuts. And so they reached this point where the bank tellers, having to look at their screen, having to use the mouse, couldn't keep up with the demand of the lines of the users, the customers that were coming into the bank. And so they essentially did a rollback is what they did. And they decided they had to implement some keyboard shortcuts and other kind of keyboard controls to be able to optimize that experience for a bank teller. But yeah, what a constraint. I mean, it's such an easy assumption to make. People are going to use a mouse. Like, that seems like a reasonable assumption to make when you're designing software. But again, thinking about that context and the bank teller's needs of like being able to kind of look as well as they act, it wasn't necessarily something that was thought through in the design, and ended up being like a really big challenge in this huge software project. So those are sort of my three stories, and hopefully kind of through them you can see this theme of just realizing there are some things that seem totally obvious, or other things that seem like we're on a really great problem that we want to solve, or other things where maybe we're not even really thinking about our end user, we're just thinking about ourselves, as I was doing in that first story, and not really thinking about it through the lens of that user need. And so I think that's kind of, if you take anything at all away from today, that would be sort of the challenge to you is how do we avoid installing ceiling fans, which for whatever reason, that story just stuck with me so like in such a deep way that that's kind of how I always think about this is like, check my assumptions, make sure I'm not installing ceiling fans. But however you want to kind of remember it. So make sure there's sort of three strategies that I would advise to think about, like how you can make sure that you are avoiding installing ceiling fans. And actually, wait, before I even keep going, I kind of lost track of part of the Zoom UI just disappeared on me. Were there any questions, or did anybody have any kind of chime-ins? Take silence as a no.
There is nothing in the chat, so.
Awesome. Okay, so the rest of this kind of conversation is going to be much more kind of in, feel free to chime in more, because it's not going to be like storytelling. We'll just be kind of talking through these strategies. How do we avoid installing ceiling fans? And I'm going to recommend to you kind of having these three particular strategies. And the first is calling out assumptions by documenting them. So as I'm creating a new design project, one of the very first things that I'll do is like, I'll open up my like spec template or a Google Doc or whatever, and I'll just start a list. Like, 1, I believe that this user wants this feature. 2, I believe that this is their, like I start a lot of my assumptions with like, I believe or we believe as a team context, just because that helps me frame it of like, this is a belief and not necessarily a fact. But just writing down assumptions really helps to like call this out. And I think this is actually a fantastic thing to make as part of your team culture, especially if you're, lucky enough to have that opportunity to work in a cross-functional team where you're engaged with, developers and project managers and QA throughout the design process. All of those kind of inputs can give you and help identify assumptions in that. So call them out and document them. And this is something that you have to do throughout the whole design and research. Like new assumptions will be identified as you kind of go along. So it's something you kind of have to keep a running list of. So 2 in that strategy is to identify the riskiest assumptions and create a strategy for proving them right or wrong. So I'll talk a little bit about how I do this personally in identifying the risky assumptions, but in a very broad sense of it, it's like, okay, is the project going to fail if we're wrong about this? Then maybe that's pretty risky. Or like, well, maybe we lost a day of work on some random feature if we're wrong about this. Like, then maybe it's not a big deal. Like there's totally interesting, depending on what you consider risk, whether it's time, complexity, cost, users' cognitive load, whatever it might be, you can kind of think about risk in different ways, right? But figure out what are the riskiest assumptions on that list and create strategies for like, we could, do a usability test on this one thing, and that'll help us to validate that this assumption is either right, we're on the right path, or actually no, maybe we're wrong and we need to readjust and iterate. And then 3, be cautious when communicating assumptions. So one of the things that's really awful about assumptions, and I've seen this so many times in business, just like working in an enterprise space especially, but I'm sure it's the same in any kind of software organization, or we talk about things, right? Like we communicate our ideas, we think like, oh, this would be really great, or like, what if we did this feature? And a lot of times we can even lose sight of like why we're doing things. But I think something that is especially prevalent in all of that is we talk about assumptions as if they're facts, even if we know personally that they're assumptions. So in our mind, we're like, oh, well, this is a thing that we have to validate, but we're framing through the lens of assuming this is right. And then we talk about that with a developer, or we talk about that with a project manager, or we talk about that with a stakeholder. And now this narrative can actually perpetuate its way throughout your entire organization, where you start treating this one assumption as a fact. And that's a super dangerous thing, because then you can start fighting your own misinformation or accidental like framing of a context, because you discover, oh, actually that assumption was wrong, and you have to readjust, and now you're kind of like have this weird battle. So yeah, so that's sort of the kind of most important aspects of that. And one other kind of thing to keep in mind as you're calling the assumptions out is that our own biases can be assumptions as well. Like I, may not have the context to think about a problem, right? Just going back to that person in a mirror, like I'm a dude, like I don't have the experiences that other people have. And I certainly have biases I'm certainly not aware of, right? So make sure that you kind of think about things through the lens of biases as well, to make sure maybe there's assumptions you're not even considering that are just so implicit in how you're operating that you might maybe want to call out. This can also, a lot of times, one of the things that comes by the wayside is accessibility, and accessibility should never be an assumption. But again, that's another thing that's something that we need to call out as part of like a first first order aspect of our features. A lot of times it's like one of those last minute things where we're like, oh yeah, we need to make sure there's keyboard navigation, and we need to make sure there's alt text, and we need to make sure there's like all of these aspects of accessibility that aren't always like at the forefront of our designs. So I think the last part of this, and I think I'm doing pretty all right on time as well. The last part of this, I just wanted to talk through how I personally kind of go through this strategic validation process. So defining assumptions, I mentioned a little bit of like kind of how I call this out, but on my design documents, I'll actually start them with like, I'll do like one problem statement. Wow, this is, I need to tilt this screen back a little bit so I can write a little less sloppily. So I'll do like my problem statement, and then 2, I'll do like the outcomes, right? Like, or measures of success. Measures And then 3, I'll just write assumptions. And then I've got like the design, so like screens and specs and that kind of thing. And then like 5 is usually like the AC, the acceptance criteria. But like every single thing that I write out as like a new feature to implement, I go through each of these categories. I'm like, okay, what is the problem that we're trying to solve? What does it look like for us to succeed? What are the assumptions that I have in even defining this? And that's where we're talking about right now, right? So under that, I'll like literally every single thing that I can think of, and a lot of them become like the cost of being wrong isn't a big deal. But I'm trying to think of some like actual examples of assumptions from some recent features that I've worked on. Like one of the assumptions that I had actually on a recent feature is that users would use browser tabs, right? So we had this particular feature that there could be constraints on it around a user wanting to look at multiple things at the same time, and our assumption was that users would use browser tabs to accomplish that task. And if that assumption was wrong, it would mean we're going to have to actually implement some features to accommodate this like cross-reference side-by-side comparison sort of situation. Of course, we could also decide from a business value that that's too expensive, or we could decide that it's out of scope. But if we're making that decision, we should make it from an informed place, not just be like, well, they can do it by opening up 2 tabs, right? So that's a good example of like an assumption that I actually have currently as something that I need to validate through some user research. Anybody else do anything like this when they're kind of defining a problem statement, design spec, anything like that? Try to get a little engagement from the community.
So we do this occasionally. We do this occasionally at Infinite Energy when we're doing like our JIRA tickets and stuff. We will sometimes put in assumptions, but we do not do it on a consistent basis. And it's not just related to design. It's just related to anything that we're making an assumption about with the ticket. Some things that we miss sometimes, kind of to some of your points, were I remember we implemented a feature. We talked to one user segment of our business and did not talk to another user segment. So we implemented a feature, and when we released it to production, we were informed that that should not be there. So we had to quickly remove it because it actually impacted the other department completely in the wrong way, and we had to completely reverse everything we did.
Yeah, user communities can be particularly tricky, especially when you're in that place of like the multi-tenancy of we're serving different industries, we're serving different markets, we're serving different, like dramatically different personas of users. That's a really good one to keep in mind when you're defining assumptions.
I have an example to build a little bit on that. So I work in an agency, so we work with a lot of different clients. One of the clients we worked with produced equipment for firefighters. And so the client came in and said, well, we really want to target our main demographic are the guys that are buying all of the equipment, for their regions, for their districts, for their firehouses. So we did user interviews with those people. And then we found out that those people don't actually look at the website at all. Like they talk to their sales associate for the company. The only people that actually look at the website are the firefighters themselves. And then the firefighters come to the purchasing guys and say, hey, I'd love to get this thing that I found. Mm-hmm. So we went from having a very tech focused product, trying to focus on these people doing the purchasing, trying to get them all the specifications they would need to, because apparently, according to the guys that we talked to, firefighters like shiny things. So we actually redirected the product to be, much more into the aesthetic presentation of the products themselves, because our demographic had completely shifted based on the assumptions the client had made.
Yeah. Yeah, it is amazing kind of how dramatic like a kind of product can reframe when you kind of discover a new thing about an incorrect assumption. Cool. So the next step is ranking these assumptions. So the way that I personally like to do this, especially with like large projects, with like smaller projects, you know, a feature, whatever, you can kind of say like, this would be bad if we were wrong. These ones don't really matter. But when you get into like the landscape of like a brand new product, a new epic that you're talking about with within an existing product, for example, I really like to do like a risk matrix. So what I'll do is we'll have our assumptions, right? And like I've done this with like cards, like on a cork board in person with my team. I've done this digitally on spreadsheets or in Trello, or you could do it on Mural or Miro and Mural. They're two things, but they're almost the same. But yeah, so you've got like your different assumptions. We'll just say we've got assumptions A, B, and C. And then the way that I like to frame my risk matrix, and there are different ways of doing those and different strategies, but I like to put like risk, and then I put effort. So essentially, anything that's like down here, right, would be something that's going to take a long time to implement, a lot of effort to like design and develop and do all of that. And then anything up here, it's in that category of like, I mean, it might not be a big deal, but like if it's really high risk, then if we're wrong about it, that might mean like our entire product could fail, or like we would have to revert this entire thing because it wouldn't be tenable anymore. So it's hard to sort of like quantitatively say like this is definitely a risk of 10 and an effort of 10 versus a risk of 1 and an effort of 1. And in the grand scheme of things, this is all going to be relative for your team as well, of like a 10 for, you know, team 1 might be 3 weeks of work, or a 10 for team 2 might be a 2-year effort of work, right? But once you can start getting these, you can find there's going to be some things like, let's say the team, we're doing this exercise and the team says, you know, assumption 1, it's not a big deal if we get it wrong, and it's only going to be a little bit of effort to implement it anyways. So it's like, okay, yeah, maybe that's an easy win, or an easy thing for us to just assume is fine. Whereas something, you know, B, where it's like, it's going to be a lot of effort, but it's not super risky, maybe we should do some research around. Whereas something where it's like, you know, really anything in this box is like something that you're going to want to really evaluate and make sure you understand before you move forward. So like, you know, up here would be like your worst case scenario. Whereas like something like this, where it's like, it's not a ton of effort, but if we got it wrong, it's really risky. You kind of have to like think through like, where does that exactly mean for us, and what kind of thing do we want to apply to it? But like I said, very often I'll just, you know, rank them linearly, you know, top to bottom, of like the most critical assumptions if we got it wrong to the least critical assumptions if we got it wrong. But I don't know, there's kind of different ways that you can think through it. Oh, also, I meant to mention this kind of on this previous slide, but I'll even put, is there a question? I thought I heard something.
I think we just had someone come off mute.
Ah, gotcha. But we'll even put in technical assumptions. So I worked with a team I was working with a few years back. We were on like SQL Server 2014, and they were like, I think in order to do this and like actually have the performance be anywhere near reasonable, we need to upgrade to SQL Server 2016, which is going to mean like in a whole, you know, enterprise architecture overview and testing, and like that in and of itself was a project of upgrading SQL Server, right? So we wrote it on our assumptions list, and we made a small spike out of it. This was for like one of those epic sized projects where, you know, it was like actually that was like a 9-month feature run that we were working on. But turns out it didn't matter. It was fine. We didn't, you know, we got the performance we needed with SQL Server 2014, but or whatever year it was. But a different team actually needed the SQL Server to be upgraded, so they actually went ahead and upgraded it, which got us even better performance. So we did validate the assumption nonetheless to know if it was something our team had to invest in for this particular feature. So it's just a quick story about how you can add technical assumptions in as well. They don't just necessarily have to be about your users or your design. So then validating assumptions, and this is actually something that I'm personally very passionate about. It's research, right? There's no real better replacement for validating assumptions than research. And I'll throw, any kind of research into this bucket. Like you can validate assumptions with quantitative data, and you certainly can with qualitative data and usability testing or user interviews as well. The only kind of caveat or asterisk I'll throw on quantitative data is I feel like for both of these, they both kind of need each other. Qualitative and quantitative data are sort of like two sides of the same coin. They're not like two different soccer fields. So in order to have the full story of like, we know the pattern of what people are doing, you do need that like large scale quantitative data. But in order to really understand why people are doing it, it's really important to be able to gather that qualitative data as well. And I feel like a lot of people leave that part of it out, which is why I'm so kind of passionate about the why, that like, actual like, in person as we are now, research where you're actually like talking with people, actually able to moderate that research and understand, ask follow-up questions, dig in below the surface, that kind of thing. So what we'll do is, we've got those assumptions A, B, and C, and we decided that assumption C is like our top priority. So what we can then do at that point is we can create some kind of research plan to say, okay, in order to actually say like, okay, assumption C, we believe people that need to compare this data will just open multiple tabs. In order to test that, we should, create a usability test with a scenario that's going to require people to do that comparison and actually kind of see these two different things at the same time, maybe side by side or maybe in separate tabs they can flip back and forth between. And hopefully through that task and scenario, we'll actually see somebody do that, open up two different tabs, and then hopefully we'll not observe them complaining about it, which does happen. And then hopefully when we ask the follow-up question about their experience to verify that they are indeed like satisfied with opening the two tabs, we can get to good results. And that would actually be a really tricky one to measure quantitatively, to know that people had multiple tabs open. You might be able to do some wizardry with analytics to see page views within certain times, but you wouldn't really know for sure. So it wouldn't necessarily be super helpful in that realm, as far as I know. Anyways, I'm getting off on a tangent, getting into work mode, refocusing, validating assumptions. It's just a matter of talking with people and doing some research, or doing that spike to validate that technical assumption, right? We don't have to implement a full feature to be able to like test if something's performant, test if something's feasible, explore some code to see if we can make some changes. Technical constraints can fall into assumptions. I've talked with a lot of people that have worked on legacy products where they're like, well, my dev says I can't do this, and I say I can't do that, and they say I can't do this. And maybe it's a matter of writing those things down in the assumptions. Like, we're assuming that we can't do this, so let's prove that right or prove that wrong. Because if we can prove it wrong, then maybe that'll make it a lot easier for us, or maybe we can implement additional aspects of this feature that we want to. Okay, I think that is sort of the full gambit of kind of how I approach assumptions, a couple of stories that hopefully help make them a little bit more real to you as far as why they are important in our design journey as designers trying to reach meaningful outcomes for real people. Any other kind of questions that we can jump into?
So I'll kick us off here. So you mentioned kind of marrying your qualitative and your quantitative data together. And I've had this problem on some of my most recent projects where the data is not comparable, really, because we have our target demographic that we're testing against for qual. We're saying we're gonna target this persona, this very specific persona, but maybe our user base isn't actually that persona. So it's because they're not comparable, because they're not the same people really in any sense of the form other than they're human beings. Do you have any recommendations on kind of how to kind of resort that so that those data sets are compatible?
So is it just that they're different like demographics, or they're different types of users, like different industries? Like,
They're different demographics. So in my case, for example, it was a fintech product where the target demographic is not financially savvy, not technologically savvy, but the actual people downloading the app were both of those things. They were technologically and financially savvy. So do we just shift, or is there a way to get the quantitative data for that less savvy persona?
That's such an interesting question. And I think it would kind of go back to that business case as well, as like, is the business trying to target those people that aren't technically or fiscally savvy? That was the sort of categorization, right?
Yeah, tech and financially savvy.
Tech and financially savvy, yeah. And so if the business, and you're saying the people that are actually downloading and using the app are tech savvy and are financially savvy.
Yeah.
So if the business is trying to like target that not savvy group, then, and I'm guessing you were doing user research, like qualitative research with that not savvy group.
Correct.
I mean, there's a couple of aspects of like, okay, well, how can we shift our funnel to get that more of that kind of users in marketing, but also there's even assumptions there around, are those sorts of users, like, are we checking the boxes for those sorts of users? Like if we don't see that kind of category of user coming in and buying it, like what are maybe the assumptions they might have about our product, or maybe what are the assumptions that we have about them where we're not aligning with their values? It's tricky because like trying to like get those users is like, it does become like an interesting like that acquisition funnel kind of conversation. How to get quantitative data from that type of user. I mean, there's
maybe you
like
know
clearly yeah, I mean, clearly like you have access to those types of users because you did some research with them. I mean, you could extend your studies where you would, have like funded research of that type of user, just use the application, that kind of thing, or you could gather quantitative data that way, but that's really tricky. That's a tricky challenge.
Yeah, it's just having, and that's the biggest thing, like, because we saw when we have quant and qual, it's great, right? We can add color to the quant and say, well, this is what we see happening, and this is where the gaps are, and this might explain that behavior that we're seeing in the quant. So it's great for kind of creating a cohesive vision of what's happening, but when the data isn't really the same, because there's these huge gaps, and like, but people are dropping out of the app, but people say they love it. So what's happening here? And we found the demographic to be pretty different. So yeah, it's a tricky one, but happy to discuss it with you more later, I suppose.
Yeah. Sounds like a fascinating challenge, but also a very tricky one. Is there anybody who's kind of hanging out in the audience here who maybe you haven't previously called out assumptions during your design process that are thinking about it?
Hey, Matt, I've got a question. And I didn't raise my hand. I'm sorry, maybe I should have. I do have a question about like where do you put these assumptions at? Are you sticking them on a wall somewhere? Like how visible do you make them? Are they part of the design team? Or are they part of like the sprint team? What do you do with them to make them kind of like a reminder to everyone? And is that useful?
Yeah, so for me, I like to have them be a part of the project, and projects all have different scopes, right? Like you could have an epic that's going to be a 9-month series of many different features that go into like one large feature, or you could have just like one small thing that's going to take one dev a couple of days to implement. But either way, I think kind of having them be a part of that is the ideal. And if you have a cross-functionally engaged team, having the whole cross-functional kind of aspect of it, like having your devs participate in contributing to the assumptions, contributing to this documentation, reviewing your designs and acceptance criteria and all that kind of stuff, I think is really helpful. So, this looks a little bit different for me at my previous job than it does at my current job. But currently, this is pretty close to what that looks like of writing up a design specification. I throw out a problem statement. I throw out the outcomes / measures of success. Like, what does it look like if we succeed in this? It's not just shipping a feature, right? Who cares if you're shipping code every day? Like, ship the code, ship code, ship code. That doesn't mean you're successful. So like, what outcomes are we actually hitting? Whether that's like an analytics type thing of like a measurement of users engaging with this feature, whether that's something that we can measure through some qualitative user research and user testing, where we're having users try to complete this task and now they're able to complete some tasks that they weren't previously able to. Whatever it is that we're kind of after. And sometimes there's multiple measures. That can be a tricky aspect. But usually I'll put the assumptions right there in line with that as like my section number 3 in this kind of outline. I guess it's not always, sometimes there are additional kind of things that I'll throw into this design spec. But I'll write the assumptions as statements. They typically start with "we believe." So it's, we believe that users will compare these files by opening up multiple browser tabs. And so that's an assumption, right? And then I'll do this like, in a list. So underneath the assumption, once we've decided this is when we need to validate, we'll write in like we're going to validate this by doing some user research, or we're going to validate this by looking at analytics or whatever it is. And then once we've validated or disproved that assumption, we'll write out our conclusion. So I never at any point delete the like, we believe users are going to do this. I'll do it like, we prove that users won't. We prove that users will very angrily do this, right? Like they'll open up multiple tabs, but they'll not be happy about it. And so kind of leaving that documentation with the like feature, with the spec, whatever that design document is. For us, it happens to be in a Confluence. Previously, I was doing them in a Google Drive. Folks might have them with their ticketing system, like in Jira or something. But yeah, I don't know if that answered your question fully, but I try to keep it all together. Also, I just said to write a bunch of stuff about assumptions, but I also try to keep your specs as minimal as possible. This is a total aside, but I have found in my history as a designer that the longer a spec is, and if I answer every little nuanced question I possibly could in a design spec, the more likely the dev is just not going to read it and ask me that question anyways. So I just try to get the core points down in the spec, make sure that the acceptance criteria is covering the happy path test case, and then like let collaboration and like us being engaged with each other kind of suffice for the rest. Because if you write a 50-page spec, we're just getting back into like those days of waterfall and handoffs and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, of course. My tirade against waterfall.
So it looks like Mark has a question in the chat. I guess.
How do I open the chat?
Can you get that open? Okay, so it says, great discussion here. As a dev person myself, I often deal with assumptions on a daily basis when it comes to understanding verbal communication. Out of curiosity with regards to defining assumptions, does it make sense to use a Venn diagram to identify areas of assumptions or checklist items or overlapping interests to ensure the design is on point?
A Venn diagram sorry, I still don't see how to open up the chat. I'm so sorry. Can you read a Venn diagram to do what?
Yeah, using a Venn diagram to identify areas of assumptions.
Okay.
Or checklist items or overlapping interests to ensure the design is on point.
Would that be like between two different features or?
I think it's really just looking at trying to identify well, actually, I don't know. I'm not sure, Mark, if you can elaborate more in the chat.
Where did my mouse go? This is so technology.
So Mark, If you want to follow up in the chat, we'll circle back.
Yeah, I've never used a Venn diagram in particular when treating when dealing with assumptions, but if you were kind of looking at, oh, it's under more. I was totally missing. Sorry. Sometimes I just struggle with technology as a tech person on the edge of technology. It's kind of funny in those moments. But yeah, I've never used a Venn diagram to sort of document assumptions or kind of call out the overlapping assumptions. But if you were dealing with kind of a scenario where you're exploring multiple features or maybe multiple kind of personas or user bases that you're trying to target, and kind of seeing what are the assumptions that we're making that kind of impact multiple of these communities, I think that'd be a great idea. So I would definitely leverage that as a way to kind of call those out, pull those together, visually identify that to the rest of your team, however you wanted to use that tool.
Matt, I wanted to ask you a question. You were talking about trying to make sure design documents don't get too long. One of the things that I often run into as a developer is I do question a lot of things. So I have a tendency to bring up all the corner cases, and then I become the corner case person who everybody's like, oh, she's just bringing up another corner case. So how do you kind of avoid those situations where you end up trying to figure out every nuanced possibility of assumptions or anything like that?
First off, I'll start off by saying that as much as your coworkers might get frustrated with you, they are also blessed by you. I've always been sometimes frustrated, but very grateful to the corner case people in my life. So definitely don't stop doing that. It is tricky, right? Like, but I think, so another aspect of it, right, is you have the opportunity to think through, okay, there are these edge cases, but a lot of times those edge cases are pretty impactful to the design. Like, they could turn it on its head if we're not accounting for this in a concise way. So I think it's important to have those conversations. But as far as documenting those edge cases, if it's something that like we are handling, we don't necessarily need to like show like the design state for every single edge case. I think more, I would hope that those things would belong in test cases, especially because, you know, then you can categorize them as like, this is a test case that we, you know, need to write some UI automated tests for with like Selenium drivers or something, or this is a test case we should cover with unit testing. Or, you know, this is a test case we need to remember, we should test it, you know, when we're doing feature rollout, but we probably don't need to test it every deployment of every other feature, right? So I would lean towards more of the like test suite documentation, especially because tools in that category oftentimes allow you to kind of categorize those, like, how serious is this? How important is this? But don't stop bringing them up during the design process, because if you bring up a corner case that makes the design non-tenable, right, then like, all right, let's roll back to square one. That's kind of a problem. I also don't know where you're engaging in the design process, if it's kind of early on or if it's pretty late in the game and designers already kind of expect things to be like done from a design perspective when you're first seeing them.
Well, it really depends on the project. So sometimes I'm participating in a very early stage, and sometimes it's late in the game. Like after someone's already developed some of the things, then they bring me in and like, oh, don't you know about this thing? Does this look right? You know, so it's all, it depends, you know.
Yeah.
One other thing I wanted to mention was that a lot of times when we're trying to check our assumptions as developers, we do prototypes. So we do a lot of little quick prototypes to determine whether or not our assumptions are right or wrong, and whether that tech seems like the best solution for us. So.
Yes, exactly. And that's exactly why I think calling out those technical assumptions that are impacted in that scope, right, are really helpful, because then you can know, like, I need to write a spike ticket to do that validation, or you know, however your team might handle that. It looks like Mark might have replied. I think it's just the three-dimensional point of view in me asking, because lists tend to be two-dimensional. I guess to apply the Venn diagram, the example described earlier where a design feature was created for the product benefiting one industry turned out to alienate another industry and force the rollback. The Venn diagram seems to provide a means to create an overlapping area to help prioritize tasks of a feature that would keep both industries happy. Yes, okay, I'm glad I was understanding and kind of tracking with what you were meaning there, Mark. Yeah, I think that would be a great way to kind of visualize that of like, if you're considering these different personas, especially as you're trying to think through your assumptions, and right, like even as we're defining our assumptions, we're making assumptions that they're assumptions. So like, it's such a weird game, but like you can't, like human beings make literally hundreds and hundreds of decisions before you like even have your coffee in the morning. So like we're making these decisions all the time. So if we can kind of figure out what we think are our assumptions and call them out, that's really a great first step to leading us down this path. Let's see, Robert. Are designers expected nowadays to have development skills and vice versa? Are devs expected to have design skills? This is a whole topic. I can give my opinion if anybody else would like to share their opinion as well. I feel like actually, Wes, have we had a meetup on this topic? I think we have. If we haven't, we probably have talked about doing it. But yeah, I feel like you could do a whole meetup on this one topic.
Yeah, we came close when we were talking about design systems, because design systems can often cross over into building out and coding some things. Sometimes who owns that can get blurred.
Yeah, so I'll give my really brief opinion just because this is a little bit kind of tangential, I guess. But I don't believe that designers need to have development skills. I do, because that was the path that led me into design, but I left development behind, and I very purposefully do not have get access to our code base because I don't want to go look at code. Like that's not the frame of mind that I'm in when I'm designing. So it's definitely a skill that has helped me personally. Like I know it has given me a lot of advantages in being able to discuss things technically with the different teams that I've worked with. But I don't think by any means anybody should consider a requirement to be a designer. And in fact, even just as much as development as part of your skill set as a designer, I think project management nowadays is the most adorable interruption. I think project management is actually a skill that a lot of us designers find ourselves doing more and more these days. So that's like a totally different boat, right? That can really help you as a designer to be able to help organize and make sense of the things that you're dealing with on a day in and day out. It's really just, it's a matter of being, whether it's a T-shaped person or a broken comb-shaped person, but not just saying all I need to learn is UX, but also accepting you do need to understand a bit about the domains that you work with, just so you can work effectively with people. But you don't need to be able to write code. I don't believe so. I don't think that's necessary. So I think other people can fight me about it though.
I think it depends on the company you work for, right? So
that's true.
My husband he's an electrical engineer, but he became, after electrical engineer at the company he works for, who they only have about 100 employees. So he became the IT manager. He was also the only IT person. So they kind of have a person who does a different role and occasionally helps out. So for him, they asked him to develop an app, which he had to design and implement himself as an electrical engineer. So it really depends on the kind of company you work for, right? Because different expectations are there depending on how big or small the company is and whether they can afford to have all of these different roles. So sometimes there are expectations that you have all of these different skill sets, or you just figure it out as you go, right? And for our company, we have about 300 employees. We're a natural gas and electricity reseller. So we don't have a full design team. We have a marketing team. And for our company, our marketers, or our marketing team is actually the ones who do all of our design. So, but it's not the kind of design that a lot of you guys get involved in with some of the other companies that you work with, because there is not enough emphasis on that aspect of things within our company. A lot of times our developers have to have somewhat of design skills to go back and say, this doesn't seem like right, this is going to work right. Is this really the experience you want for customers? Is this really the design you want? These colors don't look right together. There's a lot of things that we end up doing as developers that don't normally fall under the hat of a developer.
Yeah, I'll echo.
I think I would. Yeah,
Go ahead,
Michelle. Yeah, I was gonna say I would echo that. I think there's no silver bullet. Depends on the organization. I work for about a medium-sized software company where we do a ton of design up front, a version of like IBM's design thinking, and essentially the design work that we do heavily informs system architecture. You know, how we build up our apps and how we stand up these services. In my background, I was a developer for a long time, and now I lead our product design group. While you don't need to be able to code, you definitely need to be able to collaborate closely with developers, is what I would say, because you need to kind of understand the constraints in which you're designing in. And again, it really kind of depends on the company and the systems you're trying to build. We're trying to kind of bring everything together into one platform. So that presents a unique set of challenges, how you build reusable components, the APIs behind them, and so on and so forth. So I can make a decision. I think, oh, this is really good. And then the developers are like, oh, this is bad for these reasons. So surface level of understanding is good. If you can go deeper, even better. But like communication is really key with the engineers building those things, is what I would say.
So I'll extend all of this a little bit farther for devs having design skills. I would extend it to having an understanding of research methodologies as well. We found this in our cross-functional teams here at 352. For those of you who don't know, that one of the developers that I work with is actually my husband, which makes things weird, but I make him listen to research. And we found it actually have a great impact on the projects we work on, because he's available to help from a functional perspective in terms of making sure that things are set up the way that I need it for testing. He's able to provide feedback around functional limitations that he's seeing during the test. You know, people are running into this one weird bug. And, you know, they're really, that's because of this database issue, for example. Those are things that I wouldn't be able to diagnose in a research call, right? But because he's able to sit in on those meetings and have an understanding of what's happening and how the process is going, he's able to provide that perspective. So I think there's value, I would say, across all verticals within your organization, is understanding, at least on a cursory level, how all of them function, because in some way, all of them impact your work, and vice versa. So I would encourage you, if you have the opportunity to learn about the other skill sets in your area, do so.
Definitely. I'll even go one step further, Michelle, in that mention of inviting others into research. We were at DMS, we were inviting the entire cross-functional team to sit in on user research. And the thing that was actually the most incredible aspect of it is the culture shifted from being one of like fighting devs to like be like, look, I know we just like got this design and this feature filed and like you just coded this thing, but like we've got to move that button and change the text, right? Like it was like this battle to now, you know, we're doing a debrief after a research session and the dev's the one who's like, we got to move that button. That was awful. I don't, you know, like, and so it totally changes the tone. It gives a lot more of that like compassion and empathy to everybody on your team that normally like only us researchers get to have that advantage, right? So yeah, I definitely recommend doing that. That's
my husband and I will actually be doing a talk we're presenting at Connect Tech next week on this topic, but we'll be doing it for one of the meetups in the coming months on how to merge these two fields, UXR and Dev, and all the ways that you can benefit. So if anybody's curious, definitely keep an eye out for that in the next few months.
That's awesome.
And if you're going to Connect Tech, come to our talk. So that's my little plug. JC, it looks like you've had your hand raised for a little while. Are you still here?
Yes. Hey, how are you guys? Sorry about that. The little thing went away. Technology, right? So funny. We are in this and sometimes things go away from us. Awesome talk. I really, really appreciate all the value you guys are putting out there. Quick question. Let's talk validation. So I have an assumption. My team prioritized the assumption. We are ready to validate. What is the best practice for validation? Do I bring 10 users and 8 tell me yes? Should I bring 100 users, 500? I would love to hear from the community. What do you guys think is the medium level where you're saying, hey, you know what? I'm comfortable making saying this data validates this assumption. Hopefully that makes sense.
It does entirely. And the first thing that I'll say is not actually an answer to your question, but to say that, and this might be a different perspective than other people, but I've just seen too many times where people think, they have to do research perfectly, so they don't do it at all. So I would just say to start somewhere, right? Like, doing any research is better than doing none. Like, we're not doing, like, it's a scientific method-esque type approach, but it's not the scientific method, like, right? Like, we're not building, vaccines or, like, we don't need to have necessarily, like, it's a factor of effort and time versus cost. So starting anywhere is better than not doing any research at all. I think that's the rule to just follow no matter what. But I will say a lot of times, right? Like, if you start doing research and you test something with 5 people and all 5 of them are like really, upset about how this task goes or really not able to complete it, that you're kind of on a certain course. I will also say never kind of throw up your arms and throw all of your work away after a single test where a single user just didn't understand how the interface worked. But somewhere in between kind of those, you can, I don't know, I am a lot looser with it probably than many researchers, but that's because I do design and I do research and I do a lot of project management and I do all of these other things, and I'm personally kind of involved in doing those, all of those aspects, right? So it's a lot looser for me personally, but it's, for teams that have a full research department, they might be a lot more in depth. I don't know, does anybody else have maybe a more thorough answer than mine?
So it depends on what you're trying to do. If you're just trying to get a quick read on usability of something, you can typically get away with 3 to 5 tests. And you can do that in an unmoderated test or a moderated test. But unmoderated, you can get results back within a day. There's lots of online tools to allow you to do that. Moderated, you actually have to schedule somebody, you have to talk to them, you have to walk them through, so that takes longer to schedule and actually accomplish. But usually 3 to 5, you can get a quick read on things. To Matt's point, you don't want to make assumptions off of one person, right? You want to have at least 2 to 3 before you have enough to really have an idea that, yes, that is actually happening. Otherwise, we refer to it as a signal. I have a signal that there might be something going on here. Let's keep an eye on it, do some more tests. By the time you get to 8 to 10, you start getting diminishing returns. By then, we typically see you're starting to hear the same stuff from people. This button's weird, or this experience doesn't work, or I don't understand what to do here. You start hearing those same responses, those same issues coming up time and time again. And that's a point where we usually say, okay, we're done. We're gonna make changes and then test it again. Now, if you're looking at quantitative data, you could have thousands of reads, right? You could have thousands of data inputs in order to get something that's statistically significant to make a decision. It ultimately depends on what you're trying to learn, how you're trying to use it for your decision-making process. If you're just trying to see, is everything copacetic? Is everything basically okay? You can do a smaller read. But if you're trying to shift an entire business away from something, you're probably going to want to have 2,000 reads and, through your quantitative data to make sure that that's because it's such a big decision, you want to have that data to back that decision. That's how we do it.
Yeah, that's basically exactly the rules I follow. That's wonderful. I thought I was just being loosey-goosey with it. But one other thread to throw on to the end of that quantitative side, a lot of times quantitative can really be helpful in that, like, did we actually hit the objective? So when you're designing a feature, make sure to write into the spec, like, add an analytics measurement on when this button gets clicked or when the user uses this particular dropdown or feature or whatever it might be. Because then you can have, like, if you don't add that in, then you never know. But if you do add in some quantitative measures as you're implementing features, you can, schedule in those times. I know it can be tricky when you're like now 3 features down the road, but like go back and look at the performance and make sure what you're actually doing is achieving the outcomes that you intended it to achieve.
Awesome, thank you.
One more thing I would add for us, if we'd have time to do like a full study with our real users, sometimes it's just nice to kind of grab people from different departments and kind of do a hallway test, like a simple cognitive walkthrough, just like, hey, can you complete this task? Because it's really cheap and fast and everyone in the company is willing to help. If they have no context, they can sometimes expose big landmines that you might have missed really fast.
Yeah, I really like that method. The key there though is that they have to have no context, because if they have any context at all, they're gonna, it'll
Be biased.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, that's, you know, and to Matt's point, like any research is better than no research, right? Putting it in front of your grandmother is better than putting it in front of no one. So, you know, just start somewhere. And even if you're sitting outside of Starbucks and you want to just offer to pay for somebody's coffee if they'll look at an app, do that.
Done that.
Awesome. Thank you, guys.
Any other questions, guys? Going once, going twice, sold. So our next meetup is November 10th. It is always the first Tuesday of the month. Same time, same place. And next month, we're going to be talking to Michael Schofield, who is the Director of Engineering at Where By Us. And he's going to be speaking on you don't need UX in your title. So definitely encourage all of you guys to come join us again next month. Thank you all for coming and participating today. Matt, thank you so much for your time today. This was fantastic. And everybody, stay away from people, wear a mask, wash your hands, and we'll see you guys next month. Thanks all.
Thank you.